Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. I'm going to talk a lot today solely about the book Patriot Games, Tom Clancy book, that guy right there. Also a movie of the same name with Harrison Ford. Great movie, completely different from the book. Maybe not completely different, but very different from the book. It's my first edition copy right there. Um, the point to this book, I think, is that it really is, since the Hunt for Red October, it's the first book that was written in the Jack Ryan universe. It's the third book he wrote, but the second in chronologically in that Ryan verse. And Hunt for Red October is really not the first in the Jack Ryan timeline. It's actually fourth, but Without Remorse is actually the first. So we'll get to that one later. I'm reading these kind of in publication order. But the prior to this, Jack Ryan, the main character, had only done one project for the CIA years before. He'd written one report. This book was early on, and the storyline is early on in Jack Ryan's career at the CIA. The movie plays out a little bit differently, just because I think of Harrison Ford's age. And yes, the movie involves terrorists, in particular Irish terrorists, having this fight with England that they had for years, which you don't really hear about anymore because that fight is essentially over. But that's the only part of the book that's really dated. Everything else kind of still works. The other thing I want to talk about is there's a bunch of rumors spreading around about this guy. So was he a CIA or an intelligence agency asset during the Cold War used to kind of scare the Russians into submission? I don't know. I could be easily convinced one way or the other on that, but let's dive in and see what it looks like. So Jack Ryan, when the movie starts, spoiler alert, we're going to talk about a 40-year-old book. Let it go. And I'm going to give away details. Jack Ryan is in London with his family. He hears an attack. He's walking along the streets. He hears an explosion. He's a former Marine. He rushes in to try to help. Turns out it was a terrorist attack against the Prince and Princess of Wales, now king, and his ex-wife, Princess Di. And then they only had one son. So, that's kind of where it sits in the book. Jack, of course, being our hero, thwarts the attack in progress and becomes a hero of the British government and their people. Now, I want to point out that Tom Clancy, when he was alive, was very open about the fact that Jack Ryan was kind of based on him and how he sees himself. That becomes important later, because Jack Ryan can essentially do no wrong. The Tom Clancy was known for being for heavily researching his books. So his fiction has sort of that ring of truth to it. It's like, wow, that really is the way that stuff works. And so the rumors go, when he published Hunt for Red October, there were a bunch of Navy admirals going, "Who told him that? Who told him that? Who told him that?" Which is part of where those rumors swirl about, was he an agency asset? Were people giving him information or not? More on that in a little bit, but let's dig into some details here. One of the things that he was very, very accurate about was during that attack, the limousines of people like the Prince and Princess of Wales, President of the United States, King of England, Queen of England, VIPs all over the world, they use bulletproof glass. And one of the things that he points out in the book was that bulletproof glass, when you build it, doesn't last forever. It does decay. And as it decays, it becomes less effective. So in the attack, he actually used that, was like, well, it was installed about a year ago. It should be good. Well, it had decayed. So they were able to get through the front seat of the vehicle and destroy or kill the driver and a security person, but they weren't able to penetrate a second layer of defenses in the vehicle, because that glass had not been exposed to UV rays from sunlight. So they were very technically accurate, and I actually worked with ballistic glass when I was still at the university side during the War on Terror. He was technically just dead nuts on, and I've worked in that particular field. In the book, Tom Clancy gets heavily into Jack Ryan the person, and as a writer myself, you're at this fine line in between how deep do I go with into the person and their psyche and backstory, and how deep do I just drive the story forward. Tom Clancy dives deep into Jack Ryan and what motivates him. And how he's not intimidated by people of rank. For example, Prince and Princess of Wales, who's now the king, the former Queen of England. Jack was more worried that he would mess up the protocol than anything else. But yeah, and I think it says something about how Tom Clancy viewed himself, because there's two stories that run around about him, and it's tough to tell now because he's passed away. Nobody can go meet him and decide for themselves. I've heard people say, well, he was always very nice. He was very, personable. And I've heard other people say it was difficult to fit his ego and him in the same room. I can tell you from speeches I've seen him give and on YouTube and some of the audio commentary on his movies, he does have an ego, right? And he's certainly is not unique amongst authors in that, but he's got a big one. So what else does the story get into? Well, one of the ways it does that sort of let's dive into Jack and how he thinks is in that courtroom scene with Sean Miller, and Harrison Ford being an amazing actor kind of brings this into the movie, but it's difficult because most of what goes on in the courtroom scene is Jack talking to himself in his head. And really what Jack is trying to do is he's looking at Sean Miller and trying to size him up. He's like, who could actually become a terrorist? What kind of person does it take to really go out and be a terrorist, to be somebody who's willing to kidnap or kill a man, his wife and their child, Princess of Wales, and their kid, their child, who's now the Prince of Wales. But what kind of person does it take to do that? They personally haven't done anything to you. They may have set policies like that, but is that any reason to kill them or kidnap them or blow them up? I mean, how does that work? And what motivates somebody to do that sort of thing? Jack Ryan really wants to understand that, which I think is an interesting way to take a character. Now, again, one of the things that his writing style does that is much different in the storytelling versus recent books is he really is allowed to get those sort of human moments into characters. So, publishers today, and even my work, even though it's independently published, readers don't necessarily want all the detail. They just want to drive the story forward. Yet he has entire chapters where Jack is like off touring a castle. Has absolutely nothing to do with moving the story forward. It's just Jack being a family man. It's setting him up as this sort of ultimate family guy and wanting to understand the world around him. But I enjoyed those chapters immensely. I enjoy reading that kind of stuff, but it's probably 60 pages you could have trimmed from a book. And would a modern audience want you to trim those pages, or would a modern publisher say, oh, you got to cut that? Or would he be allowed to keep those? And I know in his later books it gets even worse with some of that kind of stuff where it gets longer and longer and longer. And in this book there were probably 60 or 80 pages you could have taken out, but some of the later ones probably 200. But he does give that an enormous amount of information on his main character, including like Christmas night. He shows Jack up late trying to assemble toys for his kids, right? So it to me it rings of, was he allowed to do this kind of stuff because he was, sort of this potentially an asset, or was he allowed to do this stuff just because the publishing industry was different then, and he was a pretty good writer anyway? So, I don't know if that really drives the nail into, oh, he was an asset, therefore he was allowed to do this kind of stuff. Although I have heard that argument. It might just be that he was a good author and he does that entertainingly. So who knows? If he was publishing today, would a publisher look at him and say, you got to trim all that stuff? Probably not, because his name is Tom Clancy. You'll let him do whatever he wants, right? Because his books are going to sell. But if he was a first-time author, I'm pretty sure they would be slicing and dicing pretty hard. He does give an enormous amount of detail about the intelligence and planning of different operations. Like, how do terrorists go about gathering information, and how do they use that information to plan? Now, that's not necessarily anything that's classified or anything you need to go off and have some kind of clearance or experience to go figure out. That's just sort of known. And any number of history books from World War II could have taught him pretty much everything you need to know about the process that's gone through. The technology used to do it has changed, but I've got a bunch of World War II history books that basically outline a bunch of that planning stuff. So could he have necessarily gotten that from somebody at an agency and said, hey, put this in your book? Or could he have just read a bunch of stuff and said, hey, that's how it works, add some modern technology to it, fairy dust, fairy dust, fairy dust, off goes your story? That again is not really driving the nail in the he was an asset. He could have just been a great writer and kind of lucky, which is kind of what it takes. But doing those sorts of details, I think, does take a great deal of trust between the writer and the reader to finally get to a story in the end. Otherwise, you just read a bunch of pages and it doesn't go anywhere. But even this early on in his career, he was known for telling good stories. President Reagan actually called Hunt for Red October the perfect yarn. We'll get to more on that in a minute. Now, during the book, Sean Miller, of course, is arrested. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been a trial. He's also broken out of prison. And one of the things that the agencies use to try to figure out more about the terrorists is, how the hell did they actually figure out that route? somebody had to know because there weren't many people that were actually familiar with the exact route he was going to take, but the terrorists knew exactly where to hit him. So with a limited number of people, the agencies use that, the intel agencies use that to say, okay, who's the leak? Where's the leak coming from? It might have been here. Now we're narrowing it down to here, right? So, and that's kind of how intelligence work goes on. Even in business intelligence, military intelligence, it doesn't matter. You start here, you narrow it down, scientific process. Here's the possibility of what's going on here. Okay, we eliminated some options. Now it's here, now it's here, now it's here, and eventually you get to one possible solution. The terrorist operations, it was kind of interesting in that he put in the book the moment uh, Sean Miller breaks out of prison, Jack's back in the United States, and of course a bunch of people run out to tell him about the prison break that was in the movie as well as the book. But would it really, the whole premise of the book was, would they operate in the United States? And they kind of gloss over this in the movie and didn't get into details because he puts in the book something very interesting to me. And it was very true in the 80s. It's not as true today, but bear with me a second. The reason terrorists wouldn't operate in the United States then to the same extent as we've seen since then is the moment you start pulling operations here, donations from here go away. So if you are operating in the United States and then you come to us and say, come to people in the United States and say, hey, I need money, you ain't gonna get it, right? You got to leave us alone. And we're too much at the time, we were too much of a source of cash for them to really operate here. Now, Sean Miller's out on a revenge kick, so that sort of takes that equation out of it, at least for him. But for large networks, that is actually true. And they tell Jack that. And Jack uses that to say, okay, well, maybe my family's kind of safe, but I want to look and make sure, all that kind of stuff. But he goes back to the agency and he kind of researches it himself a bit. He's teaching history at Annapolis at that point in time, and which is not far off from the agency. So he goes over to Langley and he digs into some details and he satisfies himself. Hey, okay, they're not coming after my family. Yeah, they're going to leave us alone. He even goes and tells his wife, hey, we're of no political importance whatsoever. Terrorists love political targets. You and I are not politics. Therefore, we're safe. The next day, his family is attacked. And that, of course, does a couple of things. It shows, when you're still looking at intelligence data here, instead of here, you might take a guess, you might get it wrong, and you might actually regret your statements later. So, all of a sudden his family is attacked, and how does Jack live with himself as a result of that? Because, if it was your family attacked, would you live with it, or would you want to really be pissed off at yourself for saying, oh, we're perfectly safe, next day you're attacked? But that particular issue is used by Clancy, and this is one of the things that I'm not sure how well this was known at the time. Anybody who sat and thought about it could have probably figured it out. He was an insurance agent who probably had intelligence people as his customers. Maybe one of them talked a little bit more than they should have. Maybe he was an asset. Difficult to tell. But one of the things he touches on was at the time, and this was before large electronic databases like we have now, how do you get the right data for the problem you've got? You got all these agencies all over the world collecting data. I need this. It's all compartmentalized. Nobody knows who knows what. I need this. Who knows that? Well, there might be a guy way over there that does, but you can't tell because there's no direct line in between the two. Now it's a little computerized, a little bit easier. The difference is now we have a problem with scale because we're gathering a lot more data than we used to, and still how do you sort through it? So it's still a big problem. Not as much as it was, but it is still an issue. So like I said, he does dive into, how deep is the terrorist problem, very deeply. Jack kind of waxes philosophic about it for quite a bit. And one of the things Clancy hits on that, this leads me to believe he had a source or was at least talking to somebody who was very knowledgeable about, terrorists. Now, would any of this be classified? Probably not. In fact, I would absolutely guarantee you none of this is classified, but it's one of those things where it's like, okay, this really connected a lot of dots. And what did he have somebody really connecting those dots for him? Or did he just talk to enough people that he eventually connected those dots? It's difficult to say, but he's either really good at collecting dots or somebody did it for him. Because listen to this one. So he brought up, what is terrorism? That's sort of a main theme of the book. Is it a tool for smaller nations to convince bigger ones by any means necessary to change their policies and behaviors? And how do you stop it? Right. So if you're a small country and you want to convince the United States to do something, well, you can't invade, you can't attack, right? Because we're too big. You can't take us down that way. If you're Uruguay and you want to declare war on the United States, we're like, all right, we'll call it the Texas National Guard and we'll solve the problem, right? It's not hard for us to deal with that issue. But if you're a terrorist organization and you're blowing up things in cities and we can't find you, then we might start to alter our behavior a little bit. So is terrorism just a way to get big countries to change what their behavior is to the desire of smaller countries? That's exactly kind of what it is, right? Either it's countries or religious groups or whatever it is. But to get small groups to change the minds of get big groups without overwhelming force, because you can't do it. And he brings up a good point in that terrorists have to play a long game because it's really difficult to kind of bully the United States, Germany, Britain, Russia, China. And the thing he puts in the book, and Clancy kind of hits on, is if you really want to solve the terrorism problem, the United States can't do it by ourselves. Germany can't do it by themselves. The UK can't do it by themselves. Um, Russia can't do. Everybody has to work together. If you get all the big countries working together to eradicate terrorism, then maybe. But if the big countries aren't working together, it's almost impossible. Again, it goes back to that intelligence problem. Who knows what about who? And if we're all working together, then you could probably do it. But if we're not all working together, there's like 0% chance you'll never actually pull it out. Now, early after 9/11, if you recall, we were actually, most of the world was pretty united. And for a while, we were making a reasonable progress on terrorism. We're not united anymore, and it's starting to pop up on occasion. Uh, and before anybody says mass shootings in the United States are a form of terrorism, I get it, understand. It's not what we're talking about. Completely different thing. Now, Clancy does go way out of his way to describe how the entire problem was solved and how just lots of hard police work actually gets to it. But somehow he makes Jack Ryan always come out to be the hero, right? Jack Ryan is always the guy that noticed things nobody else noticed. Almost always. There's a few in the book that notice things Jack didn't, but again, Tom Clancy based it on himself, so I think it kind of strikes to his ego. He always wants Jack to be the guy that uncovered the one thing that nobody else saw, and again, Jack's our hero, so we have to do that. But his writing style is highly technical, and this is another thing I think that speaks to his ego, is that he wants you to know. It's like Tom Clancy wants you to know he's the smartest guy in every room. And I've worked with some brilliant people over the years, and most of them don't care if they know they're the smartest person in the room. Most of them actually want to learn from people that are smarter than them, or learn from people that are smarter than them on different topics. Tom Clancy was pretty damn certain he was the smartest guy in every room he walked into. Right? He was absolutely certain of that, and I think his writing comes across in a way where he wants you to understand that he is the smartest guy here. You aren't, and he's going to teach you stuff. So maybe this is the beginning of mansplaining. Who knows? But he's still a good writer, so you still enjoy it, at least through this part of his career. I'll reread the others in a bit, and we'll get to those. But at least through his third book, it's still very tolerable. Still moves very quickly, and is pretty good. By the time he got to Bear and the Dragon, it was sort of very difficult on occasion, even for me to get through it. But he did dig deeply into the psyche of a terrorist and even a criminal, and all that's great information, and all that comes across in the book. And it really makes you think about the world today in a lot of ways that I wouldn't have expected a book this old to do. But he does have lots of that information. He does connect it. There's nothing in Tom Clancy's history that would suggest up to this point that he would be the guy to make all these connections in between these little bits of how terrorist works, how law enforcement stops it. How did he make all these connections? He's an insurance salesman who was an unremarkable student before that. He was an unremarkable student at great universities, but he was still sort of, an unremarkable student. So was he an asset? Was he just a writer? Was he really lucky? Maybe it was all those things. Maybe he is just a writer. Maybe he was really good. Maybe he was an asset and he was really lucky, right? So maybe all those are true. But he does, one of the things I really appreciate about his writing, at least this early on, is that he really gets into the psyche of someone who had to kill somebody. He really gets into the nightmares that come from having to kill somebody. He really gets into, hey, if I'm put up against a terrorist, can I really pull the trigger, right? Am I a human being who could do that? And a lot of modern writers don't, like Lee Child, who I'm a big fan of. He doesn't really, Jack Reacher doesn't care. He'll pull the trigger. He's done, right? And just move on. And he'll go have tea or pie, and he doesn't care. But in this book, everybody seems to care. At least, the good guys do. The bad guys, he doesn't. That's a different story. But the one thing that does get to me and does stand out about the whole argument about was he an asset? Was he not an asset? Did he have connections? Was he planned? Was he really had a lot of Jack Ryan's career thought out really early on and connected those dots very efficiently on how one person can really make a huge difference against these larger organizations. Or at least make it look like one person can have that kind of an impact on these larger organizations. And that is the one thing that makes it very difficult to say he wasn't at least getting information from somewhere. Um, Whether he should have got that information, whether he was given that information on purpose or not, I don't know. But I think he was getting information from somewhere, and I think he was getting information he probably shouldn't have from somebody. And one of the things that leads me to that conclusion is, even in the 80s, it was difficult to get a publishing deal. In 1984, October 1st, 1984, Hunt for Red October was put out. It had a print run of 14,000 copies. Naval Institute Press almost never puts out a fiction book, right? Just about never. And that's a massive print run for them, especially back then. 14,000 now is a whole different story. So that's a lot, right? All of a sudden, by February of 1985, 4 months later, he's got a movie option. Mace Newfield had actually optioned it in 4 months after its release. I read someplace he actually got galley proofs of it before release. So the book hadn't even come out yet, and he's in the hands of movie producers, and he's an insurance agent. Come on. I'm not buying it. Somebody somewhere was at least nudging that direction. And there's a movie released for Hunt for Red October in October of 1990, just 6 years after release. And then he winds up with this book. He winds up with Red Storm Rising, which was co-authored with Larry Bond, which is an amazing book. Shortly after that, he winds up with this book right after that. This book is Patriot Games. It's amazing. Even to this day, I absolutely loved rereading it. I couldn't put it down. My kids were like, "Can you stop and do something?" I was like, "No, I'm reading my book. Leave me alone." Okay, I did stop and play with my kids, but they did have to come pull me out. But it was a great Monopoly game, by the way. But he does have a lot of information. Now, was he just living in the right area? Was he just really good at getting people to tell him tiny bits of information? He was an insurance agent, right? He did have a lot of clients who were Navy and Intel, and he lived around a bunch of them. So maybe he just went to the right cocktail parties and was managing to connect those bits of information. But again, there's nothing in his history that suggests he's that guy. He was just a good writer, I think. Was he an asset? Was he just a writer? Was he really lucky? Maybe it was all those. I really don't know. But it would not take much to nudge me over the fence into he was at least getting information he shouldn't have had and use that to write. And I think people at that point in the Cold War would have let it go if they felt it could help scare the Soviets into submission. So, and was he an asset? Wasn't he an asset? I'm 50-50 on it at this point. But, it's very evenly split. It might be 49.9 and 50.1, and which way it goes changes day by day. But was he an asset? Was he just an author? I don't know. Maybe he was both. But I do enjoy his writing even to this day, at least this part of his career. I am going to keep reading his book and doing more videos on him. But the point is, this one is great. Take a look at it. Patriot Games, the movie, hits on some of the same notes, but it is much different. And for the people that criticize it for being different, you'd need a 10-part, 1-hour episode per part streaming series to kind of cover this entire book. And movies and books are just entirely different forms of entertainment, so you would have had to slice and dice it to get into the time limits they put in the movies. So, it had to be different. But this is enjoyable. The movie's enjoyable. One or both, take your pick. They're both great. Everybody have a great day. Click like, subscribe, follow anywhere you see me. Have a good one.